If I can be like completely honest, and I think this is one of the reasons why I've taken a break from writing, the last year of what's been happening in Gaza has completely obliterated everything that I thought was important. Even in the process of publishing this book, I couldn't help but feel like, what's the point? Who is this going to help? What is this going to do?
There's that real understanding, I think, that we probably share, and a lot of, I'm guessing, like viewers, listeners share of like, it's limited. Like poetry has limitations, and maybe there's a lot of people frustrated with poetry or with art and how it gets weaponized. And there might be people whose work we admire who we feel like are failing us in this moment with language or an inability to speak. So, all of that is real.
You feel helpless. You feel like nothing is going to change anything.
It sort of increasingly becomes more urgent as things feel more dire or urgent.
But at the same time, I know it's like a billion drops of water that really pushes the wave that will make a lasting change.
I think that means the moment requires that we recommit to artistic visions or the ideas of what we think art can do. We're living through a very violently anti-art time, and faced with chaos or sort of cowardice also, and like just spite. Poetry sort of offers a way to make life livable and create a path towards a world that might be livable also.
To me, the value of poetry and the poet is, at the end of the day, to tell the truth, and that's the truth about everything.
From an Islamic perspective, I know that in the end, our efforts in anything in life are nothing without the help of God. As long as your intention and whatever you do, even writing, poetry, prose, whatever it is, as long as your intention is pure and for a cause that you think is worthy and valuable, just putting that effort forward, and God will do the rest. It's hard to ignore that feeling of helplessness, especially when it comes to a form like poetry. You really feel like, who's listening? But someone will.
I think my students show me what art can offer us in 2025.
There's collective work we have to do together that is off the page, absolutely. Poetry is also about, even as a reader of poetry, an orientation toward the world that I think we could benefit from in a time of like extreme, fast pace, not a lot of critical thinking, or an all-out war on critical thinking, on slowing down. There's this American addiction to comfort, just wanting everything quick and to not have to think about it, and just the obsession right now with generative AI and all these things at the cost of our very planet and our very futures. Poetry is so absurd. Like, you can obsess over a single word for your whole life. This book is born out of an obsession with certain words and ideas. And I think for us to slow down enough to unpack an idea, like the question of nation, like the question of safety, like the question of belonging, desire, to really get curious about our own interior world and then how we read the world around us. Those are skills that are being actively defunded in schools.
I talk to my students about writing as a discovery in the writing process, right? Being open to learning something new and not just knowing, this is how the poem is going to start and end. And so just being open to trying different things and learning something new, feeling something different that maybe you didn't anticipate.
There's this level of reading poetry and acknowledging that there's also not one answer. A lot of people get frustrated with turning to a poem and being like, how do I solve it? That skill of learning to be curious about your own thoughts is really, I think, valuable in our current moment. Critical thinking, deep attention to the world, curiosity about what's underneath a given word, image. Yeah, that idea of like reading the world. How are we really looking more closely at a given moment?
It's particularly important, I feel, nowadays to speak the truth about the world as it is, and specifically who is causing the future to be less sustainable.
I think when faced with the situation that we're in today, whether you want to call it authoritarianism, fascism, techno-fascism, whatever you want to call it, I think there is sort of a attack that is targeted specifically on the level of language. The idea of, dissenting words or dissenting sort of modes of expression become sort of suppressed. Language is sort of politicized in this way where people attempt to make it harder to speak against the things that are happening to them and the violence that's happening to them. And I think poetry offers a way of defying that and resisting that for those systems to break. So I think sort of actively engaging poetry on the level of being something that can be radical or being something that can be resistant to those structures. So it offers a way of sort of surviving that and living sort of outside of that, either mentally or spiritually. We can sort of live outside of the violence and create something that can withstand that, maybe.
I feel like the way it's encouraged now in poetry, or at least when I was growing up, is that you can write about flowers but not who's stepping on them. I think poets used to be and still are political prisoners. That's why it's so important to continue telling the truth through poetry. And I think especially in The Last Poet, the speaker is grieving the uselessness of poetry. By doing so, they're also, in a sense, abdicating the responsibility of poetry. And that's to say the unpopular thing, and maybe at times the illegal thing.
I mean, it's, to me, like, poetry is so relational, actually. And I think an antidote to the fuckery, excuse my French, you can bleep that out, of the current moment is relational, is being in relationship with one another and figuring out how to do that, how to show up for one another.
I think storytelling, poetry, writing is really powerful. And I hope that I help to show them how important writing is, how important their voices are.
It's a question I keep asking myself too. What the role of writing is when the world is the way that it is. It can be very easy to fall into a motion of performing defiance or resistance. I think sort of actively discussing or thinking like, what does that practically mean is important, because for everybody it's sort of different, or sort of, as the stakes become different, what sort of tools do we as a community of writers have that we can provide to each other?
I think we see in the first poem, the poem that leads the section, that telling the truth in front of authority or not telling the truth didn't change their eventual end, but how they continued to live at the cost of their self-respect. And I think truth and self-respect are very, very much tied together.
At its best, like, poetry is working on so many different levels that I think can be of service in this moment. But again, it's not enough for it to just stay on the page, I think.